is an artist in her own right, and we have 2 children. And it's hard sometimes to balance child rearing and being a creative artist on 2 ends. And we're able to do that, thanks large part to her. So I'm glad to recognize her. I want to recognize as well my good friend, Reverend Kenneth Dean, who's over here. Reverend Dean was the head of the Mississippi Council on Human Relations in the mid-60s. Which was basically an organizing state-level group that was organized by the Southern Regional Council. So he worked very closely with the Southern Regional Council. And I contacted Reverend Dean, just kind of cold call, emailed him with some questions about Mississippi because he knew so much. And he wrote back with a 10-page, single-spaced email response. And I knew right away that I had to get to know this man and that we had to develop a friendship. And we did develop a friendship, and one that enriched the book and has enriched my life over the last couple of years. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Reverend Dean. I don't want to take up too much time. I have probably about 5 minutes left. I do want to say a little bit about how I came to write this particular book. This book is about white Mississippians' response to the moral and political challenge of the modern civil rights movement. And I chose Mississippi in part because Mississippi has always figured as the most recalcitrant and reactionary southern state. But I chose it as well because I'm from Mississippi. And where I'm from had a lot to do with how I wrote this book and why I wrote it. I'm from a very small town called Macon, Mississippi. And my mother's side of the family has been in Macon since, for many generations, since before the Civil War. And I was born in 1972. I came of age in the late 70s, early 80s. And I often tell my students that we have a very impoverished notion of when the civil rights movement actually existed. It began in '54 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, or with Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, and it ended in '68 when Dr. King was killed. But in truth, the civil rights movement, for towns like Macon, Mississippi, the civil rights movement didn't end in 1968. The civil rights movement hadn't even gotten there in 1968. And it wouldn't get there until the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And so I grew up in a town where the legacies of racial segregation were still very much alive and still very much present. I went for the first 8 years of my schooling to an all-white segregated academy that was founded in 1968 explicitly to avoid public school desegregation. It was a big deal in my town growing up when I was a kid, when I had black kids over to my driveway and we played pickup basketball. The neighbors would call my mother. It was a town in which, racial divisions were still very stark and very alive and very tangible. And I was able to leave Macon, Mississippi, and go off to school in Chicago, and I got involved in a community organizing project on the near west side of Chicago in what was then the Henry Horner homes. And when I got there and I was working in Chicago in college, I met so many people who were refugees of the Jim Crow South small towns, people who had left towns like Macon and Indianola and Winona, all these small towns across the Deep South, and then moved to Chicago. And I began to realize during that work, and I began to see, Chicago is one of the most segregated big cities in all of America. And you begin to see the racial isolation, the sense of segregation that existed in Chicago. And I think that experience was very important for me in gaining that perspective about how pervasive issues, of legacies of racial inequality and injustice are in our region and in our country. And I think it shaped the way I wrote this book. I didn't want to solely write a book about Mississippi as a closed society, even though Mississippi was a closed society in the 1960s. And Jim Silver was the author of that book, Mississippi, the Closed Society, in 1964. And he saw firsthand the kind of racial authoritarianism that had come to the fore in my home state of Mississippi during that time. And he was a wonderful eyewitness to it. But I also wanted to write a book that could recognize Mississippi's peculiarity in terms of the depth of its racism and the pervasiveness of its inequality, but one that could also, we as Americans, could put Mississippi in a broader national context and understand that the racial inequality and the legacies of racial injustice that exist in Mississippi are not a Southern problem. They're not a Mississippi problem, but they're a national problem. And so I wanted to write a book about Mississippi in which you can kind of connect the racial conservatism of white Mississippians with the racial conservative of other white Americans, whether they were in Mississippi or California or New York or Chicago or Illinois or Detroit or wherever. And so that was the kind of goal of my book. It was not to exonerate in any way the racism of white Mississippians, but it's to implicate the nation in the legacies of racial injustice that are part of our national and not just regional or state history. So that's a little bit about how the book relates to my own background. And I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards, but I don't want to take up too much of Wesley or anybody else's time. So thank you very much for being here today. And thanks again.
We are happy to present this award, I've got it the right way around, to Joseph Crespino for his addition, valuable addition to Southern history and USA history. As you pointed out, this has a broader context than just Indianola, Mississippi. This is a small token of our
Thank you so much.
appreciation. This young man teaches at Emory University. He is an associate professor, which I neglected to say before.